Look around your room for a second. There's probably a calendar somewhere. Maybe it's on your phone. Maybe an app quietly reminds you of birthdays, appointments, or a dozen other things your ancestors never had to think about. Now imagine living 15,000 years ago. No calendar, no mirror, no medicine, no school health class. You're about 16 years old, maybe younger, maybe older. You wake up one morning after helping gather roots or carrying water back to camp. You notice something strange. There's blood. Not from an injury, not from an animal, from your own body. And here's the remarkable part. This moment has happened millions upon millions of times throughout human history. Every grandmother, every queen, every hunter-gatherer, every farmer, every woman who lived long enough to reach puberty experienced a first menstruation. Yet historians have written libraries about kings, wars, and empires while saying almost nothing about one of the most universal experiences in human life. So what actually happened? Did ancient girls panic? Did anyone explain it? How did they manage it without pharmacies, disposable pads, painkillers, or even the word period as we understand it today? The answer turns out to be far more fascinating and much more human than you might expect. But before we travel through ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, and beyond, we need to answer one question. Why did that first period happen when it did? Because it wasn't simply a matter of turning a certain age. Your body has always been making calculations. Long before modern medicine understood hormones, evolution had already built an extraordinary system. During the 1970s, nutrition researcher Rose Frisch proposed what became known as the critical body fat hypothesis. Her work suggested that girls generally needed to reach a minimum level of stored energy before menstruation could begin. Later research showed the picture was more complicated than a single percentage of body fat. Hormones like leptin, genetics, overall nutrition, and health all play important roles. But one central idea has remained remarkably consistent. Puberty isn't controlled by the calendar. It's influenced by energy. From an evolutionary perspective, reproduction is expensive. Growing a baby requires enormous resources. If food is scarce or the body is under prolonged stress, delaying reproduction can increase the chances of survival. Your ancestors' bodies understood that long before scientists did. Now think about what life actually looked like before farming. Every meal had to be found, every liter of water had to be carried, every day involved walking, climbing, gathering, or hunting. Compared with most people living today, prehistoric hunter-gatherers burned extraordinary amounts of energy simply staying alive. That changes childhood. Anthropologist Nancy Howell spent years studying the Jew/Huanzi people of the Kalahari Desert, one of the best documented hunter-gatherer populations in the world. She found that girls often reached menarche later than girls in industrial societies, commonly around 15 to 16 years of age, although there was considerable individual variation. That doesn't mean every prehistoric girl had her first period at 16. Far from it. Prehistoric populations lived in very different environments across Africa, Europe, Asia, and Australia. Climate, disease, nutrition, and genetics all mattered, but it does tell us something important. The age at which menstruation begins has never been fixed. It has always responded to the world around us. Now imagine that first experience again. Only this time, don't imagine modern silence. Because here's something historians have learned from anthropology. Many traditional societies didn't hide first menstruation. They acknowledged it. Among numerous indigenous communities across Africa, Oceania, Asia, and the Americas, a girl's first period marked an important transition in life. Sometimes there were ceremonies, sometimes temporary seclusion, sometimes gifts, sometimes advice from older women. The customs differed enormously, but one thing appears again and again. People noticed. A first menstruation wasn't treated as something invisible. Could prehistoric people have done something similar? Nobody knows. And this is where honest history becomes much more interesting than confident storytelling. We don't have diaries from Ice Age teenagers. We don't have cave paintings explaining adolescence. Anyone claiming to know exactly how a 17-year-old girl felt 20,000 years ago is inventing details the evidence simply doesn't provide. Instead, archaeologists work like detectives. They collect tiny clues, they compare cultures, they study biology, they examine surviving tools, then they build the most reasonable explanation possible. Sometimes that explanation becomes stronger as new discoveries appear. Sometimes it changes completely. That's how history actually works. Which brings us to one of archaeology's greatest frustrations. Organic materials disappear. Stone survives. Bones survive. Clay survives. Plant fibers usually don't. Leather often doesn't. Soft cloth almost never does. Imagine trying to reconstruct modern life 2,000 years from now if every piece of cotton, every tissue, every towel, and every item of clothing had completely vanished. Future archaeologists would find your buildings, your plates, your glass, your coins, but many ordinary parts of daily life would simply be gone. That's exactly the challenge historians face when studying menstruation. People often ask, so what did prehistoric women use? The honest answer is, we don't know, not exactly. No preserved Ice Age menstrual pad has ever been discovered. There isn't a cave somewhere containing neatly labeled examples of prehistoric hygiene products. Instead, researchers ask a different question. What materials were already being used for wound care? What soft materials existed in local environments? What did people know how to process? The answers include moss, soft grasses, prepared animal hides, plant fibers, bark fibers in some regions, soft wool in later pastoral societies. None of these are proven menstrual products, but all are reasonable possibilities because they were already part of everyday life. This distinction matters. History becomes much stronger when we separate evidence from imagination. And that's exactly where written history finally changes everything. Around 1800 BCE, in ancient Egypt, scribes copied what is now known as the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus. It is one of the oldest surviving medical texts devoted almost entirely to women's health. Not kings, not pyramids, not warfare, women's health. It discusses fertility, pregnancy, contraception, and menstrual disorders. Think about how extraordinary that is. Nearly 4,000 years ago, physicians considered menstruation important enough to document, diagnose, and treat. A few centuries later, another remarkable document appeared, the Ebers Papyrus. Dating to roughly 1550 BCE, it contains hundreds of medical remedies covering diseases throughout the body, including discussions of abnormal uterine bleeding and reproductive health. Ancient Egyptian medicine was not modern medicine. Some treatments worked, many did not. But the larger point is impossible to ignore. Menstruation wasn't invisible. It wasn't ignored. It was recognized as part of medicine itself. And once people began writing about women's health, our picture of the ancient world suddenly becomes much clearer. Because Egypt was only the beginning. The story becomes even more surprising when we reach Greece and Rome, where some of history's greatest physicians and some of history's greatest misconceptions about women's bodies would exist side by side. By the time we reach ancient Greece, something curious happens. Human beings had become remarkably good at observing the body. Greek physicians carefully described broken bones, fevers, wounds, pregnancy, and disease. They began looking for natural explanations instead of blaming everything on angry gods. In many ways, this was the birth of scientific medicine. But here's the strange part. Being brilliant in one area doesn't guarantee being right in another. The Greeks left behind some of the most important medical texts in history. They also left behind ideas about women's bodies that would influence medicine for nearly 2,000 years. Take Hippocrates, the physician whose name still survives in the Hippocratic Oath. The collection of writings associated with him describes menstruation as a natural bodily process, though explained through the ancient theory of bodily humors. Physicians believed health depended on maintaining a balance between blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Menstrual bleeding, in this framework, helped regulate that balance. Today we know that explanation is wrong. Menstruation is not the body removing excess blood, but compared with many later ideas, it represented an important step. It treated menstruation as physiology rather than punishment. Unfortunately, another influential thinker reached a very different conclusion: Aristotle. Few people shaped Western philosophy more than Aristotle. His work transformed biology, ethics, politics, and logic. Yet when he wrote about reproduction, his conclusions reflected the limits of ancient science. Aristotle believed that men provided the active principle of reproduction, while women supplied the material from which the child developed. Modern biology has completely overturned this model. But because Aristotle's authority became enormous, these ideas echoed through medieval Europe for centuries. One respected scholar can change history, sometimes for the better, sometimes not. Fortunately, not every ancient physician agreed. Several centuries later, a Greek doctor working in the Roman Empire would write one of the most remarkable medical books of antiquity. His name was Soranus of Ephesus. Around the 2nd century AD, Soranus completed a 4-volume work called Gynecology. Unlike many earlier writers, Soranus relied heavily on careful observation. He discussed menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, infant care, female anatomy. He even advised physicians to pay attention to a woman's symptoms instead of relying entirely on inherited theories. Some of his treatments would never pass modern clinical trials. Others sound surprisingly familiar. He recognized that painful menstruation deserved attention. Imagine that. Nearly 2,000 years ago, one physician was already saying something that many women have struggled to hear even in recent decades. Your pain matters. The Romans inherited much of Greek medicine, but they also inherited Greek superstition. And nowhere is that contradiction clearer than in the writings of Pliny the Elder. Pliny attempted to collect everything people knew about the natural world. His enormous encyclopedia, Natural History, covers astronomy, geography, animals, plants, minerals, and medicine. It is one of the greatest works of Roman scholarship. It is also filled with ideas that sound astonishing today. Pliny claimed that a menstruating woman could damage crops, spoil wine, dull blades, cause bees to abandon their hives. Modern science has found absolutely no evidence for any of these claims, yet for centuries they were repeated across Europe. That tells us something important about human psychology. People don't always believe ideas because they're true. Sometimes they believe them because someone respected said them first. And once an idea becomes tradition, it can survive for generations. But while philosophers argued and scholars debated, ordinary women still had practical problems to solve every month. How do you continue working? How do you care for children? How do you collect water? How do you prepare food? History often remembers the people writing books. It forgets the people quietly making daily life possible. Actual menstrual products from the ancient Mediterranean remain frustratingly difficult to identify. Not because they never existed, because they disappeared. Linen decays, wool decomposes, plant fibers break down. Archaeologists occasionally find textual references suggesting absorbent cloths or other materials may have been used, but direct physical evidence is extremely limited. That is why responsible historians are cautious. The internet loves certainty. Real archaeology usually deals in probabilities. Then the story shifts again. As the Roman Empire faded, medical knowledge did not simply vanish, it traveled. Some of it moved east, some survived in monasteries, some flourished in the Islamic world. Between roughly the 8th and 13th centuries, physicians working across the medieval Islamic world translated, preserved, and expanded upon Greek medicine. Among them was Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna. His monumental work, The Canon of Medicine, became one of history's most influential medical textbooks. For hundreds of years, it was studied in both the Middle East and Europe. Within its pages, menstruation appears not as a supernatural curse, but as a medical subject requiring diagnosis and treatment. That distinction matters. Medicine advances when observation replaces assumption. Another remarkable physician was al-Zahrawi of Cordoba. Often called the father of modern surgery, he described numerous instruments and medical procedures while also writing about women's health. These physicians were not modern doctors, but they approached female health with seriousness instead of dismissal. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, life looked different depending on where you lived. Popular culture often imagines the Middle Ages as an age of total ignorance. The reality is far more complicated. Many women learned about menstruation not from universities, but from mothers, grandmothers, midwives, and older relatives. This knowledge rarely appeared in official records because most ordinary women were never given the opportunity to write books. That creates one of history's biggest blind spots. The people doing the work often left behind the fewest documents. Think about your own family. Imagine every conversation your grandmother ever had, every piece of advice, every recipe, every home remedy. Now imagine none of it was ever written down. 1,000 years later, historians might mistakenly conclude that knowledge never existed. Silence in the historical record is not the same as absence. One woman who did leave written evidence was Hildegard of Bingen. Living in 12th century Germany, Hildegard was a nun, composer, philosopher, naturalist, and medical writer. Her works discussed the human body, illness, nutrition, and women's health with remarkable detail for the period. She treated menstruation as part of the natural functioning of the body rather than something unspeakable. That doesn't mean every conclusion she reached was scientifically correct. Far from it. Like every medieval scholar, she worked within the medical understanding of her own time, but her willingness to write thoughtfully about women's health makes her stand out in the historical record. Then something unexpected happened. As Europe entered the early modern period, conversation about menstruation often became quieter rather than louder. Ideas about modesty grew stronger. Many aspects of women's health disappeared behind social embarrassment. Ironically, this happened during an age that celebrated scientific discovery. Knowledge expanded. Open discussion sometimes contracted. By the 19th century, some physicians argued that menstruation made women physically or intellectually unfit for higher education. Today, those claims sound absurd, yet they influenced public policy, university admissions, and even voting debates. It is a useful reminder that science itself is not immune to cultural bias. Evidence matters, but so does the willingness to follow it wherever it leads. Everything began changing surprisingly recently. In 1888, Johnson & Johnson introduced one of the first commercially successful disposable sanitary products, Lister's towels. The technology existed. Society wasn't ready. Many women felt too embarrassed even to ask shopkeepers for them. Then World War I changed everything. Nurses noticed that cellulose wound dressings absorbed blood far better than traditional cloth. After the war, manufacturers adapted the same material into disposable sanitary pads. Within a generation, menstrual care changed more rapidly than it had during thousands of years before. Then came modern tampons. Later, menstrual cups, period underwear, medical research, public education, products that would have seemed unimaginable to an Egyptian physician or a Roman midwife. And yet, despite all that technological progress, one thing has remained surprisingly constant. Every generation of girls still experiences that first moment. The uncertainty, the questions, the realization that childhood has quietly ended and something entirely new has begun. Your ancestors felt it. Women living beside the Nile felt it. Women walking through Roman streets felt it. Medieval girls working in village fields felt it. Victorian daughters felt it. And millions of girls around the world still feel it today. The tools have changed, the science has improved, the explanations have become far more accurate, but the experience itself still connects modern humanity to thousands of generations stretching back into prehistory. Perhaps that's the most remarkable part of the story. History often celebrates emperors because they changed nations. It celebrates inventors because they changed technology. But the survival of our species depended just as much on ordinary women quietly navigating ordinary moments that history almost never bothered to record. A first period was one of those moments, small enough to disappear from most history books, important enough to shape the story of every human family that has ever existed. And maybe that's why it deserves remembering. But there's one question we still haven't answered. What did a girl actually do on that very first day? Not what doctors believed, not what philosophers argued, not what religious texts prescribed. What happened in real life? Imagine a small farming village nearly 2,000 years ago. A girl notices blood for the first time. She tells no one immediately. Not because she's ashamed, because she's confused. Within minutes, an older woman notices something is wrong. Maybe it's her mother, maybe an aunt, maybe an older sister, maybe a grandmother. For almost all of human history, this is how knowledge traveled. Not through schools, not through textbooks, not through doctors' offices, through conversations, one generation teaching the next. It's one of history's greatest paradoxes. The people who preserved the most practical knowledge often left behind the fewest written records. Historians call this oral tradition. Unlike books, oral knowledge disappears unless someone keeps passing it on. That's one reason reconstructing women's history is often so difficult. The evidence wasn't necessarily lost because women lacked knowledge. Sometimes it was lost because no one thought to write their knowledge down. Yet anthropology offers an important clue. Across many traditional societies studied during the 19th and 20th centuries, first menstruation was rarely treated as a complete surprise. Girls often learned, at least in broad terms, that one day they would begin bleeding. Exactly how much they knew varied enormously. Some communities prepared daughters years in advance. Others explained only after it happened. Some treated the event as private. Others celebrated it publicly. There was no single ancient tradition. There never has been. Human cultures are simply too diverse. Among the Apache of North America, a girl's first menstruation became the center of an elaborate coming-of-age ceremony that could last several days. She was not viewed as weak. She was viewed as entering a new stage of life. Among other indigenous cultures, periods of temporary seclusion gave older women time to teach practical skills, family responsibilities, and cultural traditions. To modern eyes, seclusion may sound like isolation, but anthropologists repeatedly caution against assuming every period of seclusion was intended as punishment. Sometimes it represented protection. Sometimes education, sometimes spirituality, sometimes all three at once. Context matters. The same action can carry completely different meanings in different cultures. Now compare that with another society halfway around the world. Ancient Jewish communities developed detailed laws concerning ritual purity, including menstruation. These laws, known today through later rabbinic writings, influenced family life for centuries. Whether modern readers interpret them as restrictive, symbolic, or spiritually meaningful often depends on religious and cultural perspective. The important historical point is this: menstruation was recognized. It wasn't invisible. Nearly every civilization developed customs around it because nearly every civilization eventually had to answer the same question: how should society respond when half its population experiences a completely normal biological process? Different cultures reached very different answers. Some celebrated it, some feared it, some ritualized it, some medicalized it, some combined all four. That diversity tells us something fascinating about human beings. Biology is universal. Culture is not. The blood itself never changed. The meaning people attach to it changed constantly, and nowhere is that clearer than in the history of pain. Today, if menstrual cramps become severe, many people reach for ibuprofen or another anti-inflammatory medicine. For most of history, that option simply didn't exist, yet women still searched for relief. Ancient Egyptian medical texts mention mixtures of herbs, oils, and poultices for various reproductive complaints. Greek physicians recommended warm baths, dietary changes, and rest in certain cases. Roman writers described medicinal plants believed to ease discomfort. Some of these remedies almost certainly did very little. Others may have contained compounds with genuine biological effects. Modern researchers have investigated herbs such as ginger, finding evidence that it can reduce menstrual pain in some women. Other traditional remedies remain unproven or ineffective. History reminds us that ancient medicine was neither entirely wrong nor entirely right. It was a long process of observation, experimentation, and occasional discovery. Sometimes people stumbled upon treatments that genuinely helped. Sometimes they mistook coincidence for cure. That's true of every era, including our own. Now think about another problem: clothing. For most of human history, wardrobes were astonishingly small. Many ordinary people owned only a handful of garments. Replacing clothing required enormous labor. Someone had to shear sheep, spin thread, weave cloth, cut fabric, sew every seam by hand. A single dress represented weeks or even months of work. That changed how people thought about cleanliness. Today, if clothing becomes stained, most of us throw it into a washing machine without a second thought. Ancient families had no such luxury. Laundry itself was hard physical labor. Water had to be carried. Soap was limited. Everything was scrubbed by hand. Drying depended on the weather. Every piece of fabric mattered. That practical reality shaped how menstruation was managed just as much as medicine or religion did. History is often driven by surprisingly ordinary constraints. Not ideology, not philosophy, simply the amount of cloth a household could afford. Then there were communities living far from cities altogether. Imagine pastoral families moving with their animals across open grasslands, or hunter-gatherers following seasonal migrations. Their solutions would naturally differ from those of urban Egyptians living beside the Nile. Portable lives require portable answers. Local environments shape everyday technology. This is why historians hesitate whenever someone claims there was one universal ancient method. There wasn't. Women adapted to deserts differently from forests. Mountain communities faced different challenges than coastal villages. Cold climates demanded different materials than tropical ones. Human ingenuity solved the same biological challenge in hundreds of different ways. That's one of the quiet themes running through all of history. People rarely wait for perfect solutions. They use what they have. Perhaps the greatest misconception about ancient life is that people were passive. They weren't. They experimented constantly. They learned from experience. If one material irritated the skin, another was tried. If one method proved uncomfortable, it changed. Innovation didn't begin with factories. It began wherever human beings encountered problems worth solving. Even something as personal as a first period became another opportunity for adaptation. Generation after generation, mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter, knowledge accumulating slowly across centuries. No patents, no advertisements, no instruction manuals, just experience. And perhaps that's why these stories remained almost invisible for so long. History tends to celebrate dramatic events, battles, coronations, empires rising and falling, yet civilization survives because ordinary people solve ordinary problems every single day. A girl's first menstruation was one of those moments. Quiet, private, rarely recorded, but repeated across every generation of our species. When you multiply one small family conversation by thousands of years, it becomes one of the longest continuous traditions in human history. Not written history, human history, and in many ways, that makes it even more extraordinary.